All right, so for this presentation, I'm going to be talking about stress. So the way that I'm going to move through this presentation, I'm going to talk about the definition as well as the history of the concept of stress. Then I'm going to move into the physiological involvement. So what bodily systems, processes, and parts of the brain are involved in stress. Then I'm going to talk about the systems, the processes, and parts of the brain that are impacted by stress, particularly chronic stress. And then I'm going to give a word about stress, so outlining what this could mean for us as psychologists, and in our field of counseling psychology in particular. And then we're going to conclude. So stress. Don't we love it? Not really. It's a process that we all experience, and it's important to recognize the different factors that are implicated in stress. So people experience stress for a wide variety of things: sociopolitical factors, physiological factors, financial factors, right? If you have debt, which I do, occupations, so the place where you work can elicit stress, right? Graduate programs. And I do want to be clear, even though this would be considered socio-political factors, I want to be explicitly clear that oppressions, right, can elicit stress. We're going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this presentation. So when we think about the definition of stress, different definitions come to our mind. And within academic scholarship, that definition of stress has varied throughout that time. And in academic scholarship, that term, stress, it's been subjected to empirical examinations. And it's important to, and I think, and not I think, but from that, we've come to learn that the term stress has different meanings in different fields. So stress, as a definition, is going to look stress as a definition in physics and engineering is going to look completely different from that of within the psychological field, right? So take, for example, engineering's definition of stress, right? It's a process where an agent exerts its force on an object, and this results in strain. When we take that, when we look at psychological definitions of stress, or how stress is conceptualized, it's a process that elicits a behavioral, emotional, or a physical response of the being. So it can be a human, it can be non-human, right? But if we look at those different definitions, there's certain things that are similar there, right? Now, hold on to that, because I'm going to talk about that in the next couple slides. So with the history of talking about stress, it's not a new concept. Greek philosophers have talked about stress for quite some time. However, it wasn't until physiology emerged that there was more explicit conversations, as well as endocrinology. So the first person to really kick off that conversation about stress, or what it was Claude Bernard. Bernard was a physiologist, and he studied, from what I understand, cells. And with studying, the way that he conceptualized stress was basically these protective things in the internal environment. So what he suggested, that there was a constant internal, interior bodily environment, that was regulating that process, that stress process. Now, Walter Cannon expanded on Bernard's concept of stress. And what Cannon did, he suggested that stress is like external factors that disrupt homeostasis. So anything that disrupts the body's regulation of itself is a stressor. And the disturbance of the body's regulation is stress. Disturbance of homeostasis is stress, right? Cannon also coined the term fight or flight. That was just like, this is like a FYI. I thought that was really cool, but anyways. However, endocrinology stepped into the game on conceptualizing stress. The way that they were conceptualizing stress is through the endocrine system. Hans Selye, potato. Anyways, that guy, Hans, he was an endocrinologist, and he reassessed our conceptions of the term stress. So he suggested that stress was how the body reacts to a stressor. And he conceptualized the stressor as a stimulus that causes stress. Selye also suggested that acute and chronic forms of stress create different effects. Acute creates a short-term effect, whereas chronic stress is associated with long-term effects. Selye's research was really important in the conceptualization of stress. So he noticed a couple of things amongst his patients. He made clinical observations of their symptoms, and he did some experiments with some rats. And they were subjected to stressors, they were subjected to threatening things in their environment. And what he noticed was that there was this illicit, there was like an activation of the endocrine system. So what he was suggesting is that the body's doing something, right, in response to some stressor or really to some stressor. And these observations, these experiments led him to develop the general adaptation syndrome. So the GAS is basically characterized by 3 stages. The first stage is the alarm reaction. So in this reaction, or in this stage, what you see is the symptoms, the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. So you'll see pupil dilation, you'll see inhibition of digestion, you will see your heart rate increasing, right? And as time goes on, your body's getting itself ready to address that stressor. So if we look here at the graph, on your y-axis, you have resistance to stress, and on your x-axis, you have time. So if we look here, here is like baseline, right? So you're going, boom, hold up, there's something here. It might be a stressor. Imagine Courage the Cowardly Dog, right? If you watch that show, you know what I'm talking about. So Courage is basically minding his own business, and then he sees a monster. And so he's like, okay, cool beans, and then sees the monster, boom, something happens here, right? What we see with the alarm stage is that as time goes on, there's that resistance to stress. So what Selye suggested is that you're seeing these physiological arousals within the body. Then you have resistance. So this second stage here in the orange is resistance. So resistance is characterized by the efforts of coping with that stressor. So this might include behavioral reactions and responses. And Selye suggested that as time went on, the resistance to stress would be a lot higher. It'd peak here. And the third stage, exhaustion or recovery. So there are two things that could happen. It's either exhaustion or recovery. In this particular picture, it's exhaustion. So with exhaustion, basically what you still see the physiological symptoms of the sympathetic nervous system. So it's there, but as time moves on, what tends to happen is the body is like using up those resources and the body becomes tired, really. In this particular stage, exhaustion occurs if that threat is not overcome. If that threat was overcome, you would not be seeing this decline. The person would go back to their original state. That's the theory. But if that threat is not overcome or it's not gone, that person's body is going to kick into overdrive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So taken together, the GAS basically focuses on how the nervous system manages behavioral and physiological responses to stress. So moving forward into psychological history, Selye suggested that the GAS was applicable to psychology, and he proposed these two different forms of stress: eustress or distress. Eustress, he suggested, was good stress, positive stress. But distress was bad, it was negative. Now, Selye, the definitions of these were very, very vague. But of note, we still use, if you looked into the psychological literature, there's a lot of research on distress, right? So we as psychologists, we've incorporated physiological, we've incorporated concepts from that originated from endocrinologist literature. Now, there were people in the field of psychology that were conceptualizing stress, but in terms of psychology. Lazarus was one of those people. Now, if you're not into the literature, Lazarus is a very big name. I keep saying his last name. His last name, Lazarus, it's Lazarus. Very, very big in the coping literature and in the stress literature. Lazarus proposed 3 different kinds of stress in their harm, threat, or challenge. So harm was defined as a psychological damage that had already been done. So just damage. Threat is the anticipation of that harm that hasn't taken place but may possibly take place. So with threat, this is more about a person's or a non-human animal, their anticipation of harm. Challenge is basically the result from difficult demands that we feel confident about in overcoming by mobilizing and deploying coping resources. So Lazarus suggested that these 3 things were different kinds of stress. And it's important to note that Lazarus suggested that there has to be some form of evaluation for us to conceptualize something as stress. You can't just show something and it's not, and that person, if, let's say, let me move back. So there has to be an evaluation of that stimulus. If that stimulus elicits a stress response, that's a stressor. If it does not, it's not a stressor. So throughout the time of talking about stress, whether it's from the physics field or from the engineering field or endocrinologist field, physiologist field, I say all these fields, or psychology field, the point is there's something that elicits a response. There's an evaluation of it. There's coping resources. And then the mind and the body interact with one another. So I have these here. So these are the 4 things in common that each of the different definitions of stress have. So number 1, the presence of a stressor. There has to be something there for you to, for it to elicit that response. So for me, that's a clown. I am very afraid of clowns. And when I don't see a clown, I'm happy. However, when I see a clown, I feel anxious. So for me, that clown is a stressor. It elicits a physiological response. Of note, my hands get sweaty when I see clowns. I almost feel like I want to cry when I see clowns. I'm not going to go into that, but that's my body's response. Number 2, there has to be an evaluation. So your brain has to be like, okay, that's a threat. That's a threatening thing. I'm scared, or you're scared, or that's non-threatening. Don't be scared. So let's keep on with this clown example, right? So if someone placed a clown in front of me, I would scream. My brain would say, oh, danger, danger, clown. Now, if someone placed a puppy in front of me, my brain would say, ooh, puppy, pet it, cute. So taken together, that my brain is going to know the difference between a stimulus that is threatening or non-threatening. To me, a clown is threatening. Please don't laugh at me, by the way. Number 3, coping processes used to deal with the stressor. So remember, your body is getting ready for you to deal with that stressor. And not only is there that physiological response, you also have the behavioral response. So what are you going to do with that stressor? So I'm faced with a clown. There are things that I can do. I can run, or I can scream, or I can throw a biscuit at this clown. I have options. Obviously, the options of throwing a biscuit would be fucked up. Excuse me, messed up. Then you have patterns between mind and body. So your mind, and I say your mind, I'm specifically talking about your brain. Your brain has to communicate with your body about the next steps. So this we're going to talk about a little bit more when we get to the sympathetic division. But taken together, when we think about stress, these are the 4 things to keep in mind: the stressor, evaluation, processes to deal with the stressor, and then the patterns between the mind and the body. So just to solidify, here's the object, the stressor. For some of us, this might be a stressor in and of itself. This might be threatening. For me, it is. An evaluation. So my brain has to figure out, is this threatening or is it non-threatening, or evaluated as threatening? Coping processes, right? While I do have those physiological reactions, I have behavioral responses at my disposal. So I can meditate, or I can make vegan brownies and cookies. Notice I said and, not or. I can make both. And then my brain has to communicate with my body. So while we think about the stress response, right, I've been saying different types of stressors. I've been talking about different kinds of stressors. Those of you that think that's funny, that I'm afraid of clowns and of paperwork, there's a reason for that. There's my own personal reasons, but I'm still experiencing reactions to both. And some people wonder, well, how can you have this response to a funny clown and at the same time to like papers? So I'm gonna, and for some people, they don't see these as threatening. Of note, I'm gonna do something to show you, to show you the point. So the next couple slides are gonna be very, very triggering. I will throw that out there. If you have a weak heart, I'm very sorry. The next slide is going to be anxiety provoking and scary. I'm just giving this as a disclaimer before I continue with this lecture. I don't want anyone saying they had a heart attack and sue me. To be quite honest, you're probably not gonna get any money from me anyway. I'm broke. Sue my mom, she has money. And my dad. Anyways, so if you want to skip over the next couple minutes, fine, feel free to do it, but I'm just giving the disclaimer there. So for some people, this is a jump scare, by the way. This is from Five Nights of Freddy. Five Nights of Freddy is a video game, and what it basically, the player is to maneuver, is to have that night last a night with haunted robotics. And these robotics are, they're controlled by the spirits of dead children. As if that's scary enough, you also have jump scares. So the player has to make sure that the character lasts through the night while dealing with this and that, right? Now, video games are not the only folks that that elicit jump scare, that put in jump scares. If you've seen the video in the middle, you know what I'm talking about. That is the worst jump scare I've ever seen, but, and I say worst, I was terrified. And we've seen jump scares in movies. Now, with jump scares, or just with like these scary things, right? You get that reaction, you get that blood pumping, that pupil dilating, that the sweaty hands, right? When you see these things, it's like, ah, oh my God, right? Now, for some people, they can have that same response with papers, like with objects that may not be perceived as threatening or as stressful. My point is that you can get the same stress response from these jump scares, from these stressors, the stressors that, might be papers, it might be a clown, it might be a puppy, right? The point is your body cannot tell the difference between a stressor that is more threatening than another. You get the same stress response regardless of the type of stressor. So after I done getting you a heart attack, let's talk about what you experienced. So now we're going to get into the physiological involvement of the body in the stress response. So what does this response look like? So if you look on the right side, I have this, this picture, and this is what, these are some of the things captured in the stress response. Now, you cannot control these things because they are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, or these responses are elicited by the sympathetic nervous system. So let me click that. So your autonomic nervous system, right, controls those automatic processes. Your sympathetic and your parasympathetic system are divisions of that system. What we've been taught is that the parasympathetic is associated with calming the body, and the sympathetic is responsible for arousing the body. In the case of a stress response, the sympathetic nervous system is going to arouse the body to get it ready to face that stressor. So what does this look like? Basically, what this looks like, the sympathetic nervous system, so let me go back. Your brain is going to send off messages, and the messages go from the brain to the spinal cord and to preganglionic axons. And depending on what's being sent down, if it's a certain neurotransmitter, it'll be sent over to the preganglionic axons. So I say this, basically your brain is sending off messages to your spinal cord. Your brain is like, holy crap, danger, help. And it'll send messages to the spinal cord. Remember, your autonomic system is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it communicates with the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. So they're communicating, is the point. Now, what is being sent out? I'll outline that a little bit more when we start talking about parts of the brain. But let's imagine that you are in a fire, right? Well, I say you are in a fire. You are not on fire yet, but you will be if you don't move. And you hear the alarm beeping, your fire alarm's going off, wee-oo, 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 right? If it sounds like that, I'm so sorry. That's got to be annoying. And you're like, holy shit, I gotta get out of here. What tends to happen is that your body's in go mode, and it's quick. It's not like a very slow, it's not a very slow process. If you think about it, that makes sense. In order for you to get out, your body has to just be in that mode immediately. So something that, the way that this works, your brain sends messages. It specifically sends action potentials down the spinal cord to preganglionic cells. The signal is going to reach that terminal and is going to release acetylcholine. And remember, we talked about acetylcholine. It's a neurotransmitter that the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system use to communicate with one another. So as the acetylcholine is going through the synapse and stimulating I say stimulating, so it's acetylcholine moving across the synapse and getting onto those preganglionic axons. It's going to stimulate. The point is to stimulate the adrenal gland to release norepinephrine as a hormone. So I'm going to talk about norepinephrine in a minute. The point is, acetylcholine in this scenario is basically a signal booster. And also I mentioned preganglionic in the second part. I meant to say that it goes to pre to post synaptic neurons. Okay, so presynaptic neurons to postsynaptic neurons. So I say all this just to move into the next part. Epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are really important when it comes to the stress response. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, they act as neurotransmitters and they act as hormones. The reason why they can be two things is depending upon where the hell they're going. So epinephrine in particular, within the sympathetic division as a hormone, it's mediated by the adrenal medulla, and that's part of the HPA axis, or part of the, not HPA axis, but the adrenal gland. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Epinephrine is also responsible for controlling all the bodily tissues associated with that stress response. And to be quite clear, so is norepinephrine. Where they go is just different. Epinephrine really prepares that body for that surge of energy. Norepinephrine, which is, it regulates various parts of the body. So it might send blood, it might help send blood to certain areas. So it might increase blood into the muscles for you to run, into your leg muscles for you to run, or it might decrease blood flow to other areas, such as like the stomach, because it's really important for you to like run out the apartment or wherever it is, than for you to like digest your vegan brownies. With norepinephrine, it's activating those organs, those parts that are conducive for action. So turning off, so not really, it's sending off some of your body's turning on those organs that are important for that stress response, for you to do what you got to do. Cortisol is also very important. So cortisol, or steroid cortisol in the book, it's associated with like turning off like the bodily systems that aren't needed for that stressor. So it'll increase blood sugar. And the way that it's going to do that is going to turn off the insulin. So the liver starts releasing glucose. It'll also suppress the immune system and aid in metabolic function. It'll also like suppress your reproductive system, because let's face it, unless you're like a thrill seeker, you're not going to be making a baby during a time of possible death. If you are, kudos to you. I will not be engaging in such behavior. With cortisol, of note, it does take minutes and hours. And so cortisol is going to be released into the system, going through the blood, and it'll be hours before it like fully calms down, before that person, before those levels of cortisol decrease. So taken together, your sympathetic nervous system is really, really, really important when it comes to that stress response. Now, it's important for us to remember two things for the stress response: hormones and neurotransmitters. Those are going to be the really important things to remember when it comes to the stress response. So I mentioned norepinephrine and epinephrine as acting as hormones and neurotransmitters. Really, really key there, right? We're also going to be talking about more neurotransmitters in the next couple slides. So now we're going to talk about how the brain is implicated in the stress response. I mentioned a slide ago that the brain sends off these messages to the spinal cord. So let's get really specific here. The HPA axis is really, really important. It's a neuroendocrine system that is responsible for controlling that stress response. So components, you have the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. So you got your brain and your pituitary gland, and then your adrenal glands. They look like eggplants. But anyways, let's continue. So hypothalamus is like the boss of the pituitary gland. We know the hypothalamus as part of the brain that is below the thalamus, hypothalamus, and responsible for bodily functions. And this may include behaviors related to sex, regulation of temperature, feeding, also with the, excuse me, I lost my train of thought. Also with regulation of the endocrine system. What we also know, it's really central for hormonal release. In particular, CRH and vasopressin. So I'll talk a little bit more about CRH when we get to that, when we get to a particular slide. But the hypothalamus is really important for hormonal release because it controls the pituitary gland. So what it does, the brain is like, oh, there's a stressor, there's the thing, and the hypothalamus is like, all right, time for me to work. And what ends up happening, it'll send off messages for the pituitary gland to produce certain things. With CRH is going to go to the interior pituitary gland, where vasopressin goes to the posterior pituitary gland. Now, CRH is, when we get to that part, we're going to talk about cortisol. So with CRH, it's meant to stimulate ACTH. And then with vasopressin is an antidiuretic hormone. Vasopressin goes to the posterior pituitary gland, and that is also used to stimulate ACTH. And my mind is completely escaping me on how adrenocortical. I will give you that when I get to that slide. But the point is, central for hormone release, CRH and vasopressin, important hormones that facilitate the stimulation of ACTH. The pituitary gland, we know it as the major organ of the endocrine system. People refer to this as the master gland. It's located at the base of the hypothalamus, and it looks like a P. It has a P-shaped structure. So I mentioned the anterior and the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary gland. These are really important. So with the pituitary gland, it contains several different cells that synthesize hormones. In particular, the the cell corticotropes, it makes up 20% of the type of cell of the pituitary gland. And this produces ACTH. So there you go. So we move from the pituitary gland to the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland basically stimulates the biosynthesis of cortisol. And it also produces adrenaline, or what we know as epinephrine. So the way that we see it at this point, the brain, and I mean the brain, the hypothalamus sends off messages, right, of CRH. I say messages. CRH and vasopressin are sent to the pituitary gland. CRH is sent to the anterior pituitary gland. Vasopressin is sent to the posterior pituitary gland. And from there, from the pituitary gland, you got the synthesis of ACTH. ACTH is spread throughout the body. It's a hormone, right? Through the blood to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland stimulates the biosynthesis of cortisol and epinephrine. Oops, go back. Also, FYI, it's found above the kidneys. Now, just a little bit more information on the HPA axis. It is implicated in the neurobiology of certain psychological disorders, in particular depression. So what these researchers found is like there's some there's some HPA axis dysregulation. So in particular, it's hyperactivity. Research suggests that HPA hyperactivity is a marker for glucocorticoid resistance, which can lead to an ineffective action of hormones on tissues that result in immune activation. So basically, this is a result of increased secretion of and reactivity of cortisol. It's also associated with HPA inflammation, inflammation that could stimulate the HPA activity. You also see the increased size and activity of the pituitary and adrenal glands amongst those with major depressive disorder. And cortisol, just FYI, when you get too much cortisol in the cases of chronic stress, it has been associated with neurodegeneration, in particular to your hippocampus. So far, the research on the presence of neurodegeneration in depression, or where parts are degenerating, isn't fully clear. Folks are just saying that it can predispose people to neurodegeneration. Anxiety disorders. So, hold on, I'm loosening my notes. So anxiety disorders, we know they're conceptualized with anxiety. So the HPA axis has been implicated in anxiety. So here are the different ones, and also in eating disorders. Faravelli and colleagues did a meta-analysis they looked at different articles that examined the role that life events and HPA axis activity plays in anxiety disorders. PTSD, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail a little bit later. So the only thing I'm going to give is that there is noted research on neurobiological changes in folks with PTSD. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Generalized anxiety disorder, what they found in their literature review, there's an increased basal cortisol in the saliva and plasma. That's what some studies reported. So where people start out on the base, in folks with generalized anxiety disorder, it's higher. And they suggested that this is more a reflection of a state instead of the trait of anxiety. So where that person is in the moment, that's associated with the activity of the HPA axis. They also made note that generalized anxiety disorder was associated with a particular syndrome called Cushing syndrome or hypercortisolism. So this syndrome is characterized by a hyperactivity. There's greater activity of cortisol, and in this syndrome, people experience physiological symptoms, increase in heart rate. It's also been correlated with like cardiovascular diseases. But taken together, generalized anxiety disorder, according to Faravelli and colleagues, it's associated with hyperactivity of the HPA axis, but they say that the research is not completely clear, given that the studies that they reviewed didn't provide evidence about adrenocortical activity. So the adrenal, the activity of the adrenal gland and the hypothalamus. The HPA axis, according to Faravelli, is also associated with OCD. However, they made note that there isn't a lot of data on the association between the HPA axis and OCD, but what they do have is that there is evidence of hyperactivity amongst those, hyperactivity of the HPA axis in people with OCD. In particular, there was elevated nocturnal plasma cortisol and higher ACTH levels in OCD, suggesting that there's an increase in activity of the HPA axis compared to those with non-OCD. But they suggest that this increase in hormonal levels might be due to the state, might be due to that current stress experienced. Social anxiety disorder was also implicated in, or the HPA axis has a role in social anxiety disorders, according to Faravelli. They reported hyperresponsiveness and hyperactivity of the adrenal cortex, but the studies that they included weren't really clear about the activity on the hypothalamus. Faravelli and colleagues also made note about the literature on HPA axis and specific phobias, and they suggested that it's very, very poor and scant. So they couldn't do a full surge on specific phobias. So when we think about looking at the research on the HPA axis and anxiety disorders, there's a suggestion that people might be measuring it in a very weird and wonky way. And basically there was the call to do better. The HPA axis is also implicated in eating disorders. Of note, there wasn't a lot of, and I thought this was kind of weird, there wasn't a lot of research on the HPA axis and eating disorders. But what Warren found was that in folks with bulimia, there's a dysregulation of the HPA axis. So there was increased secretion of cortisol in folks with bulimia. And in anorexia, the implication of the HPA axis wasn't as clear, but there was reference to increased cortisol, suggesting possible activity of the HPA axis. But once again, there's more literature that needs to be on it. Easter and colleagues, interestingly enough, they found that eating disorders, they impact pregnancy outcomes and child stress response. In particular, they documented an intergenerational effect amongst women who were pregnant and had eating disorders. So the infants that were born to mothers who currently had an eating disorder or currently had an eating disorder, their stress response was significantly higher compared to infants born to mothers who did not have an eating disorder. So taken together, the HPA axis is really, really important when we think about psychological disorders. Neurotransmitters, now we're going to talk about them. So the neurotransmitters that have been implicated in the HPA are the stress response are dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine, what do we know about dopamine? It's dope. I had to do that. So we know dopamine as a neurotransmitter that's a precursor to norepinephrine. And we also know that dopamine is really important in movement. And what we have seen with dopamine is that greater amounts of dopamine have been found in like folks with schizophrenia and I say that to mean that it's been associated with like hallucinations. So more dopamine, more hallucinations. But in response to the stress, it's actually contributed to the stress response. In particular, the mesocortical dopamine system is really, really important. So the mesocortical dopamine system is really important in memory, attention, emotional behavior, and learning, and not thoughts, but cognition. The mesocortical dopamine system connects the ventral tegmentum area, so VTA, to the prefrontal cortex. And what it does, it releases the acts. It acts as an It basically helps out with that HPA activation. So what I mean by that is it acts as an adaptive feedback, or really the capacity for it. And it prevents like excess HPA activation. So like if so much of the HPA axis was to like get to a certain point, the mesocortical dopamine system would be like, hold up, too much. So taken together, when we think about dopamine basically helps regulate the HPA axis response, or the HPA axis activity. Serotonin is also important. So serotonin, we know it from our lectures that it deals with everything. Deals with mood, sex, sleep, appetite, right? So with serotonin, what we have found is that it is associated with activation and regulation of the HPA axis. So it is associated with the stress response. In particular, researchers have noted like reciprocal interaction between serotonin and the HPA axis. So according to Lanfamy and colleagues, in their research, they saw that significant increases in 5-HT synthesis and release during stress responses. I say 5-HT, serotonin. Of note, they also noted that the administration of serotonin receptor ligands, and remember ligands is a thing, that produce increases in ACTH and cortisol plasma levels. In regards to that ligand, they provide the example of 5-HT1A agonist ipsapirone. There's a lot of hard words in here. As an example. And they also noted that there are long-term effects on serotonergic neurotransmission systems by sustained levels of glucocorticoid secretion. And just throwing it out there, glucocorticoid secretion has been implicated in the stress response. Of note in the secretion of cortisol. So also, serotonin, according to Lowry, it can sensitize subcortical circuits that are associated with autonomic arousal, anxiety, and conditioned fear. And it facilitates the limbic circuit that is associated with the inhibition of stress-induced activity of the HPA axis. So taken together, serotonin is a big player when it comes to the stress response, in addition to dopamine. So looking at it together, dopamine and serotonin are really important in the regulation of the HPA axis. And we do know that in the cases of chronic stress, they can actually damage these the respective systems. So chronic stress experienced by the individual, it can result in degeneration or I say degeneration, excuse me. It can have a long-term effect on dopaminergic and serotonergic neurotransmissions. So we've made it to this point. Now, Caitlin, what have you been talking about this whole time? Now, let me show you what I mean. So, all right. So here it is. Okay. So you have the fast-acting pathway. So I'm going to talk about the fast-acting, then I'm going to talk about the slow-acting. So here we start out, the hypothalamus sends off a neural message through the spinal cord, okay? From there, the sympathetic division of the the autonomic nervous system is activated. And from there, it stimulates the medulla of the adrenal gland. As a result, there's a release of epinephrine into the circulatory system. Epinephrine, we know, activates the body's cells, endocrine glands, and the brain. So epinephrine is going to get the body to prepare for that response. Okay. But it's important to note, if we're going to go from the hypothalamus, remember you got to get to the pituitary gland from that point. So really important there. Oh, I had arrows, said there. So it goes from here, the hypothalamus, sends a message through the spinal cord to the sympathetic division to stimulate the medulla of the adrenal gland here, which releases epinephrine into the circulatory system. And as a result, epinephrine is going to activate the body. So now we're going to talk about the slow-acting pathway. The slow-acting pathway starts off with the hypothalamus releasing corticotropin releasing factor, or CRH, into the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is like awesome, and it's going to release adrenocorticotropic hormone onto the cortex of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is going to release cortisol into the circulatory system, and cortisol is going to activate the body, endocrine glands, and brain. So remember when we talked about cortisol a couple slides ago, it's basically allocating the body's resources to face the stressor, and it's basically like turning off anything that's not necessary. So remember, you have the turning off of insulin so that the liver can create glucose, so it's increasing blood sugar, suppressing the immune system. So slow acting, basically, from the way that I understood it, the slow acting pathway is going to have your body turn off the systems not relative or not needed to face that stressor, compared to the fast acting pathway. So there, 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 there. So hypothalamus releases CRF to the pituitary, which releases ACTH onto the cortex of the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland releases cortisol, and from there, cortisol does its thing. Just as a summary. So we've talked about what processes are involved in the stress response. We talked about parts of the brain. When we think about stress, it can be emotionally and physiologically taxing on the body, and chronic stress can have impact on it. So these are the three things that researchers have highlighted that are impacted by chronic stress. So the hippocampus, bodily functions and systems, and cortical regions. The hippocampus, our good friend. So the hippocampus is the limbic structure that lies in the anterior medial region of the temporal lobe, and it's associated with memory formation. Within the stress response, it regulates cortisol. Now, here's the thing. In cases of chronic stress, chronic stress can result in the degeneration of the hippocampus. So here's how that works. No, this is going to be a hard name. DHEA, and it's also called dehydroepiandrosterone. Okay. Basically, it prevents the systemic inflammation of the body and damage to neurologic regions such as like the hippocampus. In cases of chronic stress, when there's the reduction of DHEA, and it doesn't circulate. It doesn't circulate as much as it can. And as a result, this can increase the chances of harm to these bodily systems, specifically the hippocampus. So taken together, cortisol, and I mentioned it a couple slides ago, cortisol is actually, it can be very toxic if it's exposed to if certain parts are exposed to it so often. In the cases of hippocampus, what you see is that it degenerates when it's exposed to cortisol a great deal of times. So we also see a physiological impact on the body and the system's functions. Excessive exertion of energy, this is a no-brainer. So the more time you spend facing that stressor, facing that chronic stress, that stressor in times of chronic stress, your body's gonna like lose its energy. Excessive consumptions of proteins, so your body is using up the resources that it has to face that stressor. Growth hormone is inhibited, you ain't gonna grow, especially if you're a child. Reproductive functions are inhibited. So taken together, I think that's, one more, suppression of immune system. So taken together, when we think about chronic stress, it impacts our body in different ways. And in the long run, stress can be associated with, physical illnesses, as well as some problems related to reproductive functioning and energy, excuse me. You also have the impact on the prefrontal cortex. We know the prefrontal cortex is the area that is, in the frontal cortex. I don't know how to explain that anymore. So what has been found in the cases of the prefrontal cortex are really just with impaired memory and goal-directed behavior. Shields and colleagues found that acute increases in cortisol were associated with impaired working memory and response inhibition. So the ability to inhibit prepotent responses was like decreased. Of note, the medial prefrontal cortex is really important when it comes to, or really impacted when it comes to stress. So Wilbur and colleagues, they studied morphological changes in the medial prefrontal cortex in some rats. And what they found was that when they exposed the rats, when they were examining the rats, when they compared the rats who were, when they compared the rats to the rats with the impairment to the rats with not the impairment, they observed that the rats with that impairment, they had problems with retrieval of extinction of the condition fear. And it was also accompanied by how do I say this nicely? Let me go back. So let me take a step back here. So basically, Wilbur and colleagues, they did a study on some rats, okay? What they did, they conditioned fear into these rats, and they did some extinction, some extinction with these rats. With a certain group of rats, they exposed them to certain stressors a lot. And what they did, they compared the changes, the morphological changes and the behaviors in those rats with those who were not exposed to those acute stressors. Those chronic stressors. And what they found in the rats who were exposed to that chronic stress, there was an impairment in the retrieval of extinction of the condition fear, as well as those changes in the medial prefrontal cortex. Bollinger also did a study with rats. What they found was that rats who were exposed to like chronic stress, there was reduced activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. Now, when it comes to humans, Ansel and colleagues actually found that those who experienced greater adversities, they were associated with smaller volumes of the medial prefrontal cortex. So as a result, so taken together, these studies suggest that when we subject, or not when we subject, but when non-human animals and even humans, when they're subjected to chronic stress, you do see some morphological changes in the prefrontal cortex, in particular, the medial prefrontal cortex. And as a result, you also see some changes in, I say changes, but you see impairment with goal-directed behavior, temporal memory, and within non-human animals, specifically the rats, retrieval of extinction of that stimulus, of that fear. So I mentioned a couple slides ago about PTSD. PTSD is a rather debilitating disorder, and I say debilitating, it's very, very severe. So PTSD is characterized by hyperarousal, hypervigilance, recurring memories and dreams, difficult emotions, as well as isolation and avoidance. When we look at PTSD, folks who are folks develop these symptoms after a life-threatening experience. So taken together, PTSD is a rather severe form of a stress disorder. And to make note, it's a stress response that is never turned off. So we have observed changes in neurobiological changes in people with PTSD. Substantial research has actually documented that. So when we think about neurotransmitters, right, dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, and GABA, and norepinephrine. So let's start with dopamine. Let me get rid of these so you pay attention. So when it comes to dopamine, what we have noticed is that there's decreased, there's basically decreased activation of the mesocortical dopamine system in response to those stressors. We've also seen, hold on, I'm losing myself in my notes. There it is. With serotonin, Comendi and colleagues, so with serotonin, we see an increased release of it. And this is only in response to acute stress. Glutamate, what we know about glutamate, remember it's like the excitatory neurotransmitter. And in folks with PTSD, we do see an increased glutamate transmission across several brain regions, such as the PFC, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So remember when we talked about glutamate in class, glutamate is it's associated with arousal and wakefulness. So imagine in someone with PTSD, there's a lot more activity. There's a lot more synthesis. So that person is aroused a lot. GABA is like the inhibitory, it's the inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so it basically unexcites the brain. What we found in folks with PTSD, there's lower GABA levels, so they're not getting, so when we think about the amount, they're not getting the amount compared to folks with no PTSD taken together. So taken together, we do see an impact of neurotransmitters as a result of chronic stress, in particular for folks with PTSD. Oh, and norepinephrine, I almost forgot that one. Norepinephrine, in patients with PTSD, they actually had elevations in norepinephrine. So this is associated with increased heart rate and blood pressure. All right, so taken together, neurotransmitters are impacted, and it just, the point is there are changes in neurotransmitter functioning. So brain circuitry, the hippocampus. What we've seen in folks with PTSD, there's reduced hippocampal volume. So in folks with PTSD, their hippocampus is smaller. And what we've noticed with these smaller volumes is associated with severity of trauma and memory impairment. So the more severe the trauma, the more reduced the hippocampal volume. That's what research suggests. However, some research suggests that it could reflect the toxic effects of like repeated exposure um, due to increased glucocorticoid levels or sensitivity. Um, and remember, we know hippocampus is like important for memory formation. Um, with the repeated exposure to cortisols, glucocorticoid levels, cortisols, this may promote like deactivation and failure to terminate the stress response. The amygdala, research isn't fully clear on this one. So some research does suggest there's like increased amygdala responses to general emotional stimuli that aren't associated with threatening stimuli. So this is to suggest some increased activation of the amygdala. So taken together, this suggests that a person with PTSD, they're having more of that that experience of that fight or flight response, but research isn't clear on it. Prefrontal cortex. What we've noticed in folks with PTSD, and just to give you a little bit more information about the medial PFC, it's associated with like inhibitory control over stress responses and emotional reactivity, and it mediates the extinction of the condition fear. In people with PTSD, what we've seen is that there's like a decreased volume of the prefrontal cortex and reduced activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is to suggest that people with PTSD, they struggle with inhibiting their control over their stress responses to stressors, most likely trauma-related stressors. As a result of this decrease and reduced activation in the medial PFC. Oh man, hold on. All right. Dang it. So let's go back. I wanted to show you something really cool. I didn't do it. So when we think about chronic stress, we talked about the ways in which it's implicated in different psychological disorders. We just talked about PTSD. We mentioned the role that chronic stress associated with the HPA axis impacts certain psychological disorders. When we think about chronic stress and physical health, this is really important. So when it comes to hypertension, what's been found is that chronic stress does contribute to the hypertension, to risk of hypertension. Hicken and colleagues, they used some data from the Chicago Community Adult Health Study, and they looked at the association between stress and hypertension among Chicago adults. And what they found was that there was an association between that stress, and they measured it as anticipatory stress, and hypertension. And they found like it was significant. It was a positive association. And they found that it was strongest amongst Black adults. So what they suggested is that Black adults are more prone to, they're more likely to anticipate stress associated, or excuse me, let me go back. They're more likely to be they're more likely to anticipate racial discrimination, and they suggested that because of this additional stressor, they're more at risk for hypertension. But more about that more about that piece a little bit later. But taken together, what we see, there is an association between chronic stress and risk for hypertension. When when it comes to cardiovascular diseases, show what they did a review of different studies, and they found that chronic stress can contribute to cardiovascular diseases through direct and indirect pathways. Um, they suggested that the HPA axis is most likely implicated in these pathways. And in particular, they suggested over activity of the HPA axis. So what this means is that the greater activity of the HPA axis, the greater the risk of development of cardiovascular diseases. Cancer. So I will be clear, stress does not cause cancer. Actually, research suggests that it quickens it, or quickens the growth. So Kim Fuchs and colleagues, they did an in vivo optical imaging to track the growth of a pancreatic cancer in a mouse model. So this mouse model was subjected to stress, and what they found was that stress-induced activation, or neuroactivation, increased the primary tumor growth and cell dissemination. So the tumor cells spreading out into the body. Dauber and colleagues, they also saw that in highly anxious mouse, they showed high tumor burdens during all phases of the tumor development. So taken together, research does suggest that chronic stress can quicken the growth of a tumor. HIV and AIDS. So stress doesn't cause HIV or AIDS. Don't believe the hype. Of course, we know that. Really, what we found is that it can actually speed the transition from HIV to AIDS. And it's important to recognize that folks who have HIV and AIDS, they do experience stigma related to their STI. And when we look at that stigma, that also is associated with like the increase of transition to from HIV to AIDS. Sleep deprivation, stress can in fact impact your sleep problems. It can facilitate sleep problems, actually. Mink Bassett and colleagues, they found that sleep quality impacts cortisol responses to psychological stress. So among 73 college adults, Bassett and colleagues looked at sleep quality and cortisol stress responses. And it was found that perceived sleep quality impacted cortisol stress responses, and that these were gender specific. So like dudes, I say dudes, men who reported like poor quality of sleep, they showed an exaggeration of the stress response. Now, this was a little bit opposite for women. For women, even if they got good, even if they perceived good sleep quality, they actually their cortisol stress responses were slightly reduced. So this was interesting. And then Minkle and colleagues, among 26 participants, they found that sleep deprivation was associated with like greater cortisol levels at baseline, and also amplified cortisol responses to stressor compared to control participants. So taken together, when we look at sleep and chronic stress as a whole, chronic stress can impact the type of sleep you're getting, the quality of sleep that you're getting. And it's also important to note that when people are going to bed, when they're experiencing chronic stress, they are, when they're getting to bed, that baseline level for them, like where they need to be, excuse me, not baseline level, but like the cortisol levels where they are when that person is when they're trying to sleep, is way too high. So what this means is like when the level to where their cortisol level should be, when they're going to bed, their body's still aroused, which means it's harder for them to go to sleep. And when it's harder for them to go to sleep, what some research has found is that this increases their stress response because they're stressing about not sleeping, and then they're stressing about non-sleeping. So that was really interesting to me. I thought that was kind of cool. So when it comes to coping with stress, really, really important, right? Because the way that we cope can facilitate, it can facilitate that stress response. So maladaptive coping strategies have been found to increase stress, and that makes sense. When we think about maladaptive coping strategies, the way that we conceptualize it is coping strategies that are, I don't know, maladaptive. And when we think about adaptive coping strategies, they are, I hate using this, they are adaptive. And it's important to remember that based upon the case, a coping strategy may be maladaptive, may be adaptive. What we may consider maladaptive to us might be adapted to that person, and it might actually increase stress. Now, here's what I'm not saying. If you're experiencing stress from this program, I'm not saying increase your drinking, because we do know, like, the more you drink, the more that you drink, and if you're increasing it, you're gonna see cognitive impairment. And when you're frustrated because you can't focus, that'll increase your stress. So I'm not saying go out and like buy a bottle of wine because like it's adaptive. It's really looking at it where it's effective. So taken together, depending on the type of coping strategy that you or your clients are employing, it can increase your stress or decrease your stress. Oh man. So a word about stress and coping. So there are varying exposures of stress among people. We've documented health disparities when it comes to stress. And this is really, really important, mainly because not everybody is going to be exposed to the same amount of stressors as the same amount of stressors. So one way of thinking about it is through minority stress theory. Meyer proposed this theory in 2003 to capture the health disparities experienced by gay men. This theory has since been like expanded to folks of different marginalized identities. And the way that minority stress is conceptualized is like this additional stress that is experienced by a person due to their marginalized identities. Now, it's also important to recognize the way that identities can intersect with one another. You get these intersectional oppressions, and these intersectional oppressions can like create a unique set of stressors for an individual. So I think in counseling, something that we really ought to consider is the ways in which stress looks different for everybody, and it's not in attempting to help that person cope isn't through a one size fits all lens isn't necessarily gonna, it may not capture all of their stressors, is what I'm getting at. Yeah. So in conclusion, stress sucks. And the thing about stress, interestingly enough, stress can be a good thing when we've overcome that stressor. But it can be debilitating. It can impact your physical health, parts of your brain, and facilitate, facilitate psychological, even further psychological distress. So taken together, I hope this lecture was informative. And also, if you want to go binge that Netflix show, go binge the Netflix show. the work is always going to be there. That's it.